The sound reaches you before anything else. 8 Pratt & Whitney engines. Not a roar exactly, but a presence, a vibration that lives inside your chest and behind your teeth and in the soles of your boots. You've been flying for hours, and still it never becomes background noise. It becomes the world. You sit strapped into your seat somewhere deep inside the body of a Boeing B-52 Stratofortress, and you become aware, again, of what this machine is. 159 feet of aluminum and steel, stretched wing to wing across the night sky like a cathedral that has learned to fly. The fuselage around you is dim, lit in shades of red, the low, flat glow of instrument panels, the soft halo of a workstation light, the occasional sweep of a dial needle. The year is 1972. The place, if you could see it below the cloud cover, would be Southeast Asia. Outside your window, if you can reach one, there is nothing. A blue-black void, stars, sharp and indifferent. 30,000 feet of empty air between the bottom of this aircraft and the earth below. You check your instruments, you breathe, you say nothing. You are 23 years old. You have been in the Air Force for 2 years. You have flown this route or one almost exactly like it enough times that the pre-flight briefing barely surprises you anymore. And yet something in your body never fully settles. Some small, quiet alarm that never quite goes silent. Beneath the clouds, in the darkness below, is Vietnam. You're 30,000 feet above it, and the mission has already begun. There are 6 of you. 6 men inside a machine large enough to carry more explosive payload than most Second World War bombing raids combined. 6 men sealed inside a pressurized tube in the stratosphere, each one responsible for a piece of this aircraft's survival. Up front, in the upper deck, sit the aircraft commander and the co-pilot. They are the ones with windows, real windows, facing forward into the dark. They fly this aircraft not by feel, but by procedure. The B-52 does not forgive improvisation. At altitude and speed, everything is deliberate, everything is rehearsed. The aircraft commander has more than 1,000 hours in this airframe. His hands move across the controls with the calm economy of long practice. Behind and below them, on the lower deck, the navigator and radar navigator sit side by side before their scopes. The navigator is responsible for where you are. The radar navigator is responsible for where the bombs will go. Between them, they carry the mathematical precision of the entire mission. No one else on this aircraft knows exactly what is happening on the ground below. No one else needs to. You are the electronic warfare officer. Your station is buried in the aircraft, surrounded by equipment that listens. Radar warning receivers, jamming systems, electronic signals that reach up from the earth and attempt to find you. And your job is to make sure they don't. You watch your scope the way a sailor watches the horizon, not for what is there, but for what might appear. At the back of the aircraft, separated from everyone else by the length of the fuselage, is the gunner. He sits in his pressurized station near the tail, watching the sky behind you. His 4.50 caliber machine guns are an inheritance from another era of air combat, a gesture toward defense that feels both necessary and slightly symbolic in the modern age. He is, in many ways, the most alone of all of you. Together, you make a crew. Together, you make the machine work. The B-52 around you is enormous from the outside and oppressively cramped within. The passageways are narrow, the equipment fills every surface. You cannot stand fully upright in most of the aircraft. When you climb through the access hatch and settle into your ejection seat, the space around you shrinks to the dimensions of your instruments, your switches, your responsibilities. This is your world for the next several hours. You have learned to stop thinking about the size of what you are carrying in the bomb bay. The briefing this morning, or was it yesterday evening, time has grown strange, described the target in clinical terms: a logistics network, a supply route, a grid coordinate on a map that means nothing to you visually, but means everything to the radar navigator and his scope. Arc light, that is the name for these missions. There is something poetic in it almost, a bright arc drawn across the sky. You try not to think about what it looks like from below. The flight toward the target is the longest part of the mission. Hours of level cruise, hours of darkness and cloud and the unchanging rumble of engines. The crew talks when there is something to say. There is rarely something to say. You exchange status checks, you monitor your systems, you eat your box meal and pour bad coffee from a thermos. But underneath the routine, underneath the practiced calm, there is a current that runs through all of you. The radar navigator has been quiet for the last 40 minutes. That means he is working. That means you are getting close. You run another scan of your warning systems. Nothing unusual. But nothing unusual is not the same as safe. You know the North Vietnamese radar operators are down there. You know they are patient. You know they have learned over years of this war to wait for the right moment before illuminating their tracking systems. They have learned that patience costs less than missiles. Your scope is clean, for now. The clouds below have thickened. There is no visible ground. There are no visible fires, no searchlights, none of the visual drama you might have imagined when you were younger and thought of war as something you could see. From this altitude, in this darkness, the war is an abstraction. It exists in coordinates and signal frequencies and the weight of the aircraft beneath you. The aircraft commander's voice comes over the interphone, measured and flat. 30 minutes out. You acknowledge. The crew acknowledges. The aircraft flies on. The final approach to the target is defined by precision. The radar navigator's voice picks up cadence. Short calls, technical, procedural. He and the navigator are threading the aircraft through an invisible window in the sky. A precise heading, a precise altitude, a precise airspeed. Because the bombs do not land where you want them to land. They land where the math says they will land. And the math is unforgiving. The aircraft flies straight and level. This is the most dangerous part of the mission, and also the most inflexible. You cannot jink, you cannot deviate. The release point exists at one specific location in the sky, and the aircraft must arrive at it on the exact second the computers demand. You watch your scopes. Your hands rest near your jamming controls. The radar navigator calls the final sequence. Seconds count down inside his instruments. The bomb bay doors somewhere beneath you cycle open. You feel it more than hear it. A subtle change in the aircraft's aerodynamics. A new note in the vibration. Cold stratospheric air floods briefly through the seams of the fuselage. And then, the aircraft rises. Not dramatically, not violently, but unmistakably. As the bombs release in sequence, dozens of them, 500-pound and 750-pound general-purpose bombs falling away into the darkness, the aircraft becomes lighter. The nose lifts, almost gratefully. Tons of weight simply cease to exist beneath you, and the aircraft remembers that it is, at its heart, a thing that wants to fly. The bomb bay doors close. The radar navigator calls bombs away. The aircraft commander begins the turn. You do not see what happens below. It comes without warning, as it always does. Your radar warning receiver lights up. A missile tracking radar. You recognize the signal signature immediately. The specific frequency of a Soviet-supplied SA-2 surface-to-air missile battery has found you. Your hands move before your thoughts do. Jamming systems activate. You call it out over the interphone, voice level because there is no other way to say it in this aircraft. Panic is a luxury that exists outside this fuselage. The aircraft commander calls for a turn. The B-52 begins to bank, and you feel the weight of the aircraft's size in this maneuver. This is not a fighter jet. This does not snap and dart. A fully loaded B-52 turns like a continent changing direction, slowly, inevitably, with tremendous committed energy. You are not evading so much as repositioning, altering the geometry of the missile's problem. The warning light holds, then shifts, then fades. You exhale. The crews who flew the Linebacker 2 missions in December of 1972, the 11-day campaign that would become the largest use of B-52s in the war, did not always exhale. 15 B-52s were shot down in those 11 days. 33 crew members were killed or went missing. Others were captured. Others came home. The SA-2 missile stood nearly 35 feet tall and could reach altitudes that the early planners of Strategic Air Command had never imagined a surface-to-air weapon achieving. The North Vietnamese operators had been trained well. They had adapted. They had learned the B-52's habits, its altitude, its routes, its predictable turns after bomb release. Tonight, your jamming holds. Tonight, the geometry works in your favor. The warning scope goes quiet. You make a note in your log. Your hand is completely steady. The turn away from the target feels different from everything that came before it. The navigator gives the heading for egress. The aircraft settles onto the new course. The engines continue their unbroken 8-part harmony. But something in the atmosphere of the crew compartment has shifted, almost imperceptibly. The forward lean of tension has eased by 1 degree. The radar navigator runs his post-release checks. The co-pilot calls out fuel state. You continue monitoring your electronic warfare systems. The threat does not end at the target, but the quality of your attention changes. You are watching, still, but you are no longer braced. The aircraft commander says nothing for a long while. Then, good work. 2 words. In this crew, on this aircraft, on this night, they carry the weight of everything that did not happen. The flight back will take hours. Hours of the same darkness, the same cloud cover, the same engine vibration, the same cold coffee. You will follow a reciprocal course back to Andersen Air Force Base on Guam, or to Utapao in Thailand, or wherever tonight's mission originated. The base will be lit up when you arrive. There will be trucks and crew chiefs and the particular smell of jet exhaust and tropical air. There will be a debrief. There will be food. Somewhere in the middle of the Pacific sky, the tension finishes leaving your body. You hadn't known how much of it you were carrying until it goes. The crew begins to talk again, quietly, without urgency. Small things. The aircraft commander mentions a letter from his wife. The navigator makes a dry remark about the weather forecast. The gunner, back in his isolated tail station, reports his position and calls it a quiet night. You look at your scope. You look at your hands. You look at the dim red glow of your instruments, which have watched over you for 9 hours now and demanded nothing more than your attention. Outside, the sky begins to lighten somewhere far to the east. Pull back now from the interior of that aircraft. Pull back from the 6 young men in their red-lit stations, from the warm smell of electronics and recycled air, from the specific weight of this one mission on this one night. Between 1965 and 1973, B-52 Stratofortresses flew more than 126,000 sorties over Southeast Asia. They dropped in total nearly 3 million tons of ordnance, more than the entire Allied bombing campaign of the Second World War. The crews who flew those missions were, on average, in their early to mid-20s. Many of them had never fired a weapon in their lives before the Air Force. They were trained technicians, instrument readers, system operators, men who turned war into procedure, and procedure into something they could survive, hour by hour, sortie by sortie. The distance between where they sat and where their bombs landed was measured not only in altitude, it was measured in something harder to name. A man in a fighter jet sees the ground rush toward him. A man in a B-52 sees a radar scope, a targeting solution, a set of coordinates that belong to no landscape he has ever walked. The abstraction was not chosen. It was simply the nature of the machine and the altitude and the war that required both. This is not a judgment. It is a fact about what modern air power asks of the people who fly it. The young men who climbed into those aircraft, who strapped into ejection seats and put on their helmets and watched their warning scopes for the glow of a missile lock, carried that distance home with them, carried it quietly, the way you carry anything you cannot fully explain to someone who was not there. You're thousands of miles from home, flying a bomber older than most of the crew, and tonight, the war continues beneath the clouds.